Welcome to The Forgotten, Episode 4, The Prussian Waterloo. I am afraid I have to apologize again for this episode airing late. I had the whole of Wednesday evening after the Germany-South Korea game planned for recording, a game which I consider to be an easy victory, after which I wanted to get to work on this episode. Oh boy, how wrong can one be? After the match was over, my fellow soldiers and I were so shocked that we drowned our grief in beer. Kölsch to be exact. And I was not really able to work on the episode in an appropriate manner. I am sorry for this, it won't happen again, especially not because of the World Cup games of Germany, of course, because, well, there are not going to be any, and this episode will last about half an hour to make up for my sins. We left our Prussian officer right before a decisive event in European history. Not too much hasn't been said already about the Battle of Austerlitz, but to everyone who has not heard about it, the battle in which Napoleon defeated Emperor Francis of Austria and Emperor Alexander of Russia, hence the whole Battle of the Three Emperors, Drei Kaiserschlacht story, was a battle unrivaled in the history of war, given how all events played perfectly into Napoleon's hands and he just read his enemies like an open book, predicting their every move. My main issue with this battle is that Napoleon knew how well he had done, and became incredibly smug about it. He never stopped mentioning it, at every given opportunity, quite notably when the sun rose over the fields surrounding a little farm town called Borodino. Napoleon saw it and yelled, "Voilà le soleil d'Austerlitz," look at the sun of Austerlitz, and led his army into the bloodiest battle until the Somme offensive in 1916, and, in my eyes, a complete and utter strategical fiasco. I'd love to discuss this with the rock-hard fans of the Emperor of France. Anyways, this is certainly not the history of the Corsican Emperor, but rather of a captain of the Prussian army, who had left his cozy home estate close to Jauer to join the forces of General von Hohenlohe-Ingelfing in Sierrach in southern Prussia, where the forces are deployed to threaten Napoleon with a show of force. On the 11th of December, the army moves to Bayreuth, where Gneisenau has the chance to talk to his old friends and visit a distillery and a brewery to learn about making booze, as he wants to start producing alcoholic beverages to improve his finances. When the Austrians made peace with the French on the 24th of January 1806, the Prussian corps commanded by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, a man whose path we'll cross over and over again and who maybe deserves a miniseries in his own right, in which Gneisenau serves, moves back to their respective garrisons. Gneisenau's prediction had been right. He had assumed that every nation who challenges Napoleon alone would suffer swift defeat, and that only a concerted effort by all major powers would be able to defeat the quote-unquote usurper. Nonetheless, on the 10th of March, Gneisenau's battalion arrives in Jauer. But his stay should not be too long. In August, the clouds on the diplomatic horizon lead the Prussian High Command to assemble their forces and unite with the Saxon allies in today's Thuringia, and, arriving on the 4th of October, Gneisenau's battalion joins the avant-garde, advanced guard, led by the Prussian Apollon, Louis Ferdinand, Prince of Prussia. Details about him will follow later. Gneisenau, military theoretician by heart, assumes that the main strike of the French forces will hit somewhere in the area around the River Saale, but his diaries show a little more about the feelings about his war. As a patriot, I must sigh. So much has been lost in peace, which should have prepared us for war. I've predicted what the French are going to do, but I'm a nobody, and nobody listens to me. This will change over the course of the next years, and it's going to be the best for Prussia. On the 10th of October, he participates in the first major battle of the war, the skirmish close to Saalfeld. Important for two reasons. Firstly, Gneisenau uses the tirailleur tactics for the first time himself. His company, being the advanced guard of the advanced guard, bears the brunt of the fight, While the Prince of Prussia is ordered to advance on the French while defending the Saale crossing at Rudolstadt, but retreat if attacked in force, his 9,000 men and 39 cannons meet the 14,000 men and 14 cannons, parts of the divisions Suchet and Gazan, and the cavalry division Trélard. This was a result of the famous talent of Napoleon to move several corps separately and let them march to the sound of the guns, as he himself did not at all know where the Prussians and Saxons even were. When Gneisenau's company surprisingly met the French, he staved off several attacks and, against all orders, counterattacked marvelously successful, pushing the enemy back to reorganization. This fighting started at 5:30 and lasted until 9:30, where the prince, who already knew that the enemy had crossed the Saale elsewhere and that he was in danger to be cut off, met with Gneisenau personally. There is hardly anything to be found in his letters or diaries about this conversation, but I imagine how it must have been for the little captain to talk to the heir apparent himself, and he must have already imagined how this was going to blow him up the career ladder. But the prince was not really long for this world anymore. The prince, extremely happy with Gneisenau's performance, ordered him to defend the retreat of an artillery battery over the bridge at Rudolstadt at 1400 hours. In the 4.5 hours between the meeting and this order, the tirailleurs of Gneisenau held off the French forces. Gneisenau even took command of the whole battalion sometimes, as his commander proved to be utterly incapable and was partly relieved of his duties during the battle. The general retreat led to a general panic in the Prussian ranks, about which the official report states that everyone lost his head except for Captain Gneisenau, but the captain, overseeing the retreat of the artillery, was wounded by a graze to his leg. The retreat got completely out of hand then. The French columns managed to bypass the Prussians and cut them off the Saale bridge. The Prussians had to retreat swimming, losing most of their muskets and, most importantly, all guns. They had lost around 1,700 men to death and blessings. The disaster was perfect when the French cavalry attacked the retreating troops, causing a massacre, and, the second important point, killing Louis Ferdinand in the process. Gon was one of the more capable Prussian leaders of this war, and Gon was the best witness to Gneisenau's commendable conduct. What a shame. Another important repercussion of the battle was that the message of the closing Frenchmen caused terrible disarray in the Prussian and Saxon forces, who, in the night of the 11th, started firing at each other, probably because the Saxons overheard two Prussian officers speaking French, not at all uncommon for officers at the time. Furthermore, on the false message of the French enclosing, the Prussian bakery destroyed tens of thousands of breads so they did not fall into the hands of the enemy. These shenanigans, as you may call them, only ceased on the night of the 13th, one day before the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt. It's not too hard to imagine how the morale must have been. I want to come back a little to the Prince of Prussia. I mentioned him to be the Prussian Apollon. This comes from his marvelous talent in music. He was a terrific pianist and even composed together with Beethoven, of which he was an ardent admirer. He was a brave officer and a masterful tactician, maybe a little too dashing, but still a fiery commander. Very notable is his complete disregard for the borders of class, meeting the salons of the bourgeoisie, even, and I'm sorry I have to say it like this, even Jews. He was a very enlightened person. The poet Theodor Fontane, who wrote many patriotic poems, rhymed this about him. 6 foot tall, looking like a god of war, beloved to his comrades, divine to beautiful women, blue-eyed, blonde, dashing, and in his young hand, the old Prussian rapier, Prince Louis Ferdinand. If you dislike all those poems, please tell me and I shall refrain from quoting them all the time. If you want to hear them in German, please tell me as well. Although what I said sounds harsh, it does not mean that the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt was already pre-decided by this. The Prussian casualties were harsh, the effect on morale was quite bad, but Napoleon still had no idea where the Prussian main body was stationed, and his reconnaissance failed him completely. So, when he arrived in the city of Jena in the evening of the 13th, he considered that what he had found was the Prussian army. He occupied the city without a fight and started to prepare for a major battle. Unbeknownst to him, however, He had found the army of the Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfing trying to block the way to Berlin, which Napoleon wanted to take in a death blow to the Prussian state. The forces of Marshal de France Lannes, the victor of Saalfeld, get taken over by Napoleon himself, who can rely on several reinforcing corps, amounting to a force of around 96,000 men. Nonetheless, he sent a messenger to Davout, telling him to hastily march to his aid, as he did in Austerlitz defending the villages of Sokolnitz and Telnitz. The corps commander did not reach him in time, but we will see that order becoming extremely relevant shortly. The French advance had not gone unnoticed by the Prussian commander, the 60-year-old Friedrich Ludwig, Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfing, Prince of Hohenlohe-Öhring. I'll stick with Clausewitz here and just call him Hohenlohe. The man, meritorious commander of the battles of the First Coalition War, showed his utter incompetence to deal with the modern tactics, which had completely surpassed him. He did not at all expect having to battle the French here, and did not take any precautionary measures, neither did he take favorable defensive positions. The Prussian forces received conflicting orders from the division's commanders and the force's command, causing additional disarray. The 38,000 men expect reinforcements by 15,000 men under the command of General von Rüchel. But both sides did not know the strength of the other. Unnoticed and unexpected by the Prussians, the French troops moved their guns up the Landgraf, a hill close to Jena, which the Prussians had considered not to be passable for artillery. But, working the whole night, the French managed to get a significant amount of corps and divisional artillery up there. So, in the foggy morning hours of the 14th, with music, riding officers in their Bastogne uniforms, and with a very effective and terrible artillery support, the French colonnes d'attaque marched on the Prussian lines. There is no reaction from headquarters, and the first line is shattered in mere minutes, mainly because the forces, which had lost the Battle of Saalfeld a few days prior, reinforced of course, but demoralized, had to bear the brunt of the French assault. The Prussian troops just vanish, and Napoleon managed to split the Saxo-Prussian army into two. Note that Gneisenau did not take part in the battle because of his wound, which probably saved his life, as the mass of his company did not survive the battle because they were forced into fighting in a line again. At 0930 finally, Hohenlohe takes action. He mobilizes what he has available and intends to counterattack the head columns of the French in force, which might have been a sound plan if it wasn't for the execution. Fearing that his forces were way too weak to stop the attack, he pretty much just put them into their starting positions and let them stay there, waiting for Rüchel's 15,000 men to arrive. So the Prussians stand there for 19 minutes straight, in perfect lines and in perfect sight of the French artillery and skirmishers. Imagine spending a nice World Cup game while being under constant artillery barrage and being threatened by musket fire. Sounds like a fun thing to do to me. The French, constantly being reinforced by the arriving corps, forced the Prussians to expand their line further and further to avoid being encircled. This of course thinned out their lines, to the point where the French pretty much walked through them, smashing through with ease. Nonetheless, the brutally drilled Prussian soldiers somehow managed to retreat in order. This, however, does not last for long, as Napoleon's brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, the Grand Duke of Berg since the establishment of the Rhine Confederation and a brilliant cavalry commander, which I will most certainly make some episodes about in the future, is ordered to pursue the army and utterly and completely shatters it. The battle is not yet over as Rüchel's 15,000 men arrive and desperately try to guard the retreat, but it quickly gets overrun and their commander is severely wounded. Prussian force suffered around 10,000 dead and wounded, and another 10,000 captured, whereas the French suffered around 7,500 dead and wounded. Gneisenau's company is down to 75% of its strength before the Battle of Saalfeld. So, what are the reasons for this defeat? Firstly, the Prussian reading of the terrain, especially the passability of the Landgraf, was terribly short-sighted and wrong. Secondly, the Prussians had no clue of what they were dealing with and did not realize that they were confronting the main body, the whole of 3 army corps. This led to the point number 3, numerical inferiority, which is quite important, especially if you're, point 5, blessed with a woefully inadequate commander. The inflexible Prussian command had little to no control over the battle, and sacrificed their last troops to prepare an attack, which, finally, they could not even mount. So, sit down, Hohenlohe. Hindsight gives you a big red F. But while this defeat was terrible, it was again not the end of the world. Not alone, that is. Because 30 kilometers south of the Battle of Jena, the Battle of Auerstedt pretty much sealed the deal for the Saxo-Prussian army. Because this time, the main army under the command of Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, who I will call the Duke of Brunswick, the son of the great Duke of Brunswick who defeated the French at Minden and several other occasions during the 7 Years' War, is going to get it. Remember how Napoleon ordered Davout to Jena? On his way to the battle, Davout encountered Prussian forces. Both him and the enemy were startled by this encounter, but the excellent French tirailleurs managed to hold off the enemy and keep them busy, so that the advanced guard of the French can take the village of Hassenhausen. Had Davout known that he poked almost 42,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry and 230 cannon with his 26,000 infantry, 1,300 cavalry and 44 cannon, he would probably have been a little more cautious. But with the terrible reconnaissance of both sides playing into the game again, he decided to fight it out. The Prussian High Command quickly notices the dominant position of Hassenhausen and does all it can to reconquer it. At 0930 hours, Blucher's cavalry starts a massive assault, but is quickly shattered by the artillery and infantry forming squares. Around 10 cavalry regiments break off the battle and are completely lost. After this half hour, at 10 am, the Prussians again start a massive infantry attack. The mass of the Prussian artillery supports the attack, and it quickly becomes a bloody affair. After the battle, a French staff officer wrote that the entrance to Hassenhausen looked like the gates of hell, and the front divisions of Davout fought bravely, defending the village to the last. Just as it looked like the Prussians succeed, Brunswick was hit in the head and lost his eyesight. Later on he died of the terrible wound, both eyes being shot out. King Frederick Wilhelm III, however, does not bother with assuming any command, which resulted in terrible confusion and disarray, especially because every divisional commander pretty much did what he wanted to do, causing the attacks to be uncoordinated, and allowing Davout to reinforce his positions at Hassenhausen and to start a counterattack at 1100 hours. Davout, although he was a tyrant and an iron disciplinarian, showed what he can do. When the Prussian forces had to retire under the massive pressure the French applied to them. Finally, Frederick William III did something. He ordered a general retreat. Not using his intact reserve under Frederick Adolf von Kalkreuth. Kalkreuth, a man sour about having to command the reserve, was not at all pleased with that. So the Battle of Auerstedt was a loss too, but not moderately as bad as the Battle of Jena, still costing 10,000 wounded and around 3,000 captured, but leaving the army intact and on a well-organized retreat. Davout's corps lost 7,400 men and was pretty decimated as well, considering its initial strength. But what happens if well-organized troops on the retreat encounter their comrades running away with only their lives from another battle, being chased by cavalrymen, and being utterly smashed? Morale bites the dust. All order in the Prussian army dissolves quickly, and Frederick William is certainly not the charismatic person to rally his men behind him. Neither are his commanders. The following retreat leads Gneisenau to write to a friend of his youth, "I'd rather die 1,000 times than live through this hell again." For Davout, the battle went great. Napoleon, who did not even believe him when he was told about the victory, later made him the Duke of Auerstedt. Why did the Prussians lose here? The reasons are pretty similar to the Battle of Jena, except this time it's Frederick William and Brunswick who were way too passive. With a better reconnaissance, they would have easily smashed the French, but the risky gamble of Davout had paid off handsomely. Murat's cavalry did their own, as they kept chasing the army, taking important cities by forcing the surrender of the disillusioned garrisons. The fortresses of Erfurt, Spandau, Stettin, Küstrin, Magdeburg and Hameln fall into the hands of the French without firing a single shot, Küstrin being a massive walled fortress which the French might have never taken. Many of the commanders were sentenced to death from Königsberg, today, I'm sorry for having to say that, called Kaliningrad, where the Prussian king had found refuge as the Russian forces arrived to head the Prussians out. Nonetheless, the war was, so far, a complete disaster. But not all hope was lost yet. Blücher, assisted by the young Colonel von Scharnhorst, led a well-organized force sizable enough to still threaten the French on a sound retreat towards Lübeck. Sizable Freikorps, made of shattered units and volunteers, form. The best-known Freikorps of the time, the Freikorps of Lieutenant Ferdinand von Schill, who was wounded in the Battle of Jena, formed in the little city of Kolberg, today Kolobrzeg, in Pomerania. He gathered a small force of willing men and started raiding the countryside, disrupting the French reinforcements and supply, and generally being a terrible annoyance to the Grande Armée. But this is, after all, a podcast about Gneisenau. So what did he do at the time? Even on the disastrous retreat, the captain wrote an essay about the defeat. Allow me this longer quote. The incapability of Brunswick to design a solid plan for the entire campaign, the indecisiveness, known to be a feature of people his age, the inarguable misluck, the mistrust of the army and its capabilities, the animosity between the high-ups of the general staff, the sacking of its best members, the army being unused to war, the lack of preparation in all of its branches, the terrible micromanaging of tactical affairs, the recruitment system which only calls a part of our people to arms, not at all enough of them, taking them into service for too long, causing them to be dissatisfied with their service and only tied to the army by discipline, not love, the company economy, the terrible state of our regimental artillery, not at all able to keep up with the French horse artillery, the incapability of most of our generals, and most of all our vanity and grandeur, which caused us not to go with the time. This makes a real patriot sigh in agony. He reaches Königsberg in December and is ordered by the king himself to help forming new battalions of volunteers. On the 17th December, he is made a major by the king himself for his remarkable conduct and solicitude. He gets to know the Freiherr vom Stein, Secretary of Finances, and becomes a close friend of him because he shares his hunger for reforms. We will see this friendship causing a lot of good for Prussia down the road, but as we Germans say, a lot of water will flow down the Rhine until that happens. Major von Gneisenau gets ordered to New East Prussia, the whole area from the Vistula over today's Bialystok to the river Memel, and has to help organizing the recruitment and training of 19 new Prussian battalions in January of 1807. But the winter is harsh, the morale is terrible, and due to the Canton Reglement, he is not allowed to group several battalions into larger cities, making an efficient oversight and training impossible. From there, he writes another letter I want to translate to you, for the king himself, dated to the 27th of February. The use the French make out of their light infantry forces us to expand our own. The author of this essay wants His Majesty to know that he would have lost his life and all of his company if he had not decided to pick up the skirmishing himself. The enemy infantry then refused to make a single step forward, but remained on a certain distance, although the Prussian muskets surely did not harm them too badly here. This message is accompanied by the request to join the field army again. But the king sends a disturbing message, pretty much saying, "Your effort has been noted, but we'll wait with those reforms until the war has been won." Gneisenau must have been unnerved out of his mind by this. The king is losing this war terribly fast, but he still does not want to change the way of leading it. This is, even from our distant perspective, absolutely not understandable. But at least Gneisenau is ordered to join the garrison of Danzig with 2 of his battalions, assuming command over them. To a friend from Erfurt, he writes while he's at sea, "Well, well, our beloved generals and governors, that will make wonderful lines in history. The glorious and renowned Prussian army, untrained by priests. If one wants to be a warlike state, it is not surprising that you actually have to go to war sometimes. War is an art, and all arts have to be trained. But yes, we have drawn in our horns, but we will want to show our teeth again someday. Just having spent a week in Danzig, Gneisenau is reached by royal decree, stating that the commander of the city of Kolberg, Colonel Lucadou, I quote, is not, because of his age, able to sustain the necessary incessant exertion, and that we want to transfer command to a man who has both the necessary knowledge and power, and thirst for action, to defend the fortress with all means. I do believe that you have those qualities, and I pronounce you to be the commander of Kolberg. Gneisenau immediately leaves for the city. Down the Vistula in nothing but a little boat, being under fire several times and still reaching the fortress on the 29th of April to write history for the first, but most certainly not for the last time. I want to end this episode on this note, because next time we will have lots and lots of space to talk about the siege of Kolberg and its meaning for the Prussian spirit and the reforms, as well as the meaning for National Socialist propaganda. Speaking of which, I have announced on the Facebook page of the podcast that I will not tolerate people with extremist pictures and profile posts, being either left or right wing. I do beg your pardon, but this is my policy, and just calling it a bias is inarguably wrong. If you have some problem with migration or whatever, if your view of the world differs from mine, I do not at all mind. I simply do not want a discussion about any of those topics on my page. Fight your battles in a battlefield of your choosing, but not on my turf. I just want to underline that I will pursue any kind of extremist sign, be it the red star, the swastika, hammer and sickle, or SS runes, and so forth, with all measures I can take. And to everyone who thinks National Socialism is a leftist socialist ideology, seriously? When did the sentiment you have become your opinion so you can just spout it out on the internet without even fact-checking it a little? Wikipedia is enough for falsifying this. I'm going to drop the mic here, and I will not discuss this topic any further. If you are offended, yes, be offended. Dislike the video or however you please. But do not disturb the listeners of this podcast or me anymore. I'm sorry for this little outbreak, but I wish everyone a good day or a good night. See you next time.